stronger the emotion you feel, and the more you pay attention to the picture, the more you're conditioning the body over time to the future instead of the past. So now you keep knocking on that genetic door emotionally, then that emotion ultimately signals a new gene that upregulates that gene to produce better proteins. And the person then all of a sudden starts healing. And we have research to show that people can do that in 4 days, signal genes to reduce cancer cells.
I was in the biking portion of the race, and I was coming up to this intersection, and there were two cyclists that were turning onto another road. And there was a police officer that was standing on the opposite side, and he was pointing at me, and he was telling me to turn and to merge onto this road. And so I was locked in on him, and I wasn't paying attention to the road. And the problem was he had his back to the oncoming traffic. So as I made the turn, a four-wheel drive Bronco going about 55 miles an hour hit me from behind and catapulted me out of my bicycle. And I landed on my lower back and my buttocks. And when you land very hard, the compressive force basically puts a downward pressure on the vertebrae. And the compressive force compressed 6 vertebrae in my spine. The 8th thoracic vertebrae, the 9th thoracic vertebrae, 10, 11, 12, and the first lumbar vertebrae. And when you compress volume like that, the matter has to go somewhere. And in my case, it went back towards my spinal cord. One of the vertebrae, the 8th thoracic vertebrae, was more than 60% collapsed, and the neural arch where the spinal cord passed through had broken like a pretzel. So I had multiple compression fractures of my thoracic spine and upper lumbar spine. I had bone fragments on my spinal cord, and I had compression of the cord because of the neural arch being fractured. And so they took me to the hospital, and I had 4 opinions from 4 leading surgeons in Southern California, and the prognosis was I'd probably never walk again, and that I needed a radical surgery called the Harrington rod surgery. And in Harrington rod surgery, they basically cut off the back parts of your vertebrae. They screw in these long stainless steel rods. And by screwing those rods in there, they cantilever and pull the spinal column off the spinal cord, and it opens up the pathway. And then they take bone fragments from your hip and they paste it over the top, and they hope for the best. So in my case, it would be from the base of my neck to the base of my spine because of the number of vertebrae that were compressed. So I decided for myself personally that I was willing to step out into the unknown, that I couldn't imagine myself living on addictive medications for the rest of my life or being in a wheelchair. And so I decided to check out of the hospital. And I just had this one thought, and the thought was the power that made the body heals the body. And I couldn't stop thinking about that because I knew that there's an intelligence that's giving us life, that keeps our heart beating and digesting our food. And that consciousness is awareness, and awareness is paying attention. So it must be observing or paying attention to who I am. So I decided that I was going to make contact with this intelligence. And I was going to give it a plan, a template, a design. I was going to get very specific on what I wanted. And when I was happy with my creation, I was going to surrender this creation to a greater mind because it knows how to heal way better than I do. And the second thing I said was I'm not going to let any thought slip by my awareness that I don't want to experience. Now, this sounds really easy from an intellectual standpoint, but I learned very quickly that I couldn't get my mind to do what I wanted it to do. And when we're in crisis or trauma, like I was, we tend to focus on what we don't want to have happen instead of what we do want to have happen. So out of the infinite potentials that exist for us as human beings, I was selecting the worst case scenario over and over again in my mind and embracing that emotionally and being prepared for that event, because if anything less happened, I would have better chances of survival. And I think when we're in crisis, it's those survival chemicals, those hormones of stress that prepare us for the worst case scenario. So I would start off in my mind reconstructing my spine vertebrae per vertebrae. And then I'd start thinking about living in a wheelchair. And then I'd become aware that I was focusing on what I don't want to have happen instead of what I do want to have happen. And I'd stop and realize that I'd have to start all over. And the reason being was because this intelligence is a presence. And just like when you know someone is present with you, they're paying attention to you, and you know when they're not, and they're distracted. So I reasoned that I had to be completely present with it, and it had to get a very clear signal, a very clear plan. So I would start all over again and start reconstructing my spine, and then I'd start thinking about, should I sell my home, should I sell my practice? And I'd stop again, become conscious, and then I'd get frustrated, and then I'd get impatient, and then I'd get angry, and then it would just get worse. And so for 6 weeks, I went through this incredible dark night of the soul because I couldn't really get my mind to do what I wanted it to do. And it would take me about 3 hours closing my eyes and reconstructing every single vertebrae and starting over again every time I lost my attention. And then I was never satisfied really with the way it was, way I did it, but I would just keep going. At the end of 6 weeks, I went through the whole entire process without losing my attention. And it was like I hit a tennis ball in the sweet spot. Something clicked in that moment. I clicked. And I knew in that moment that something happened. And what was taking me 3 hours to do, I was able to do in 45 minutes. And at the time, I didn't know it, but I was firing and wiring new circuits in my brain every single day. And I was literally improving my ability to pay attention. And attention is a skill, just like golf or tennis. The more you practice it, the better you get at it. So I wasn't going anywhere. I wasn't doing anything. I was basically laying face down, and I had a lot of time on my hands, so this was the object of my affection. At that time, when I was able to go through that whole rehearsal, I started noticing significant changes in my body. My pain levels dropped and diminished immediately. Some of the neurological problems I was having were improving. Numbness, tingling, my motor function started coming back. And the moment I correlated what I was doing inside of me with the effect that I was producing outside of me, I started paying attention to what I was doing and did it with more passion and more enthusiasm instead of dread and frustration. And it was that elevated emotion that I started to realize that was actually the catalyst to make it fun and easy. And then I just started thinking about if I was ever able to walk again, what did I take for granted, like a sunset or a shower or sitting with my friends and enjoying a meal. And all of a sudden I started selecting potentials in the quantum field that were no longer based on the worst case scenario, but really some future possibility.
The latest research in epigenetics says that it's the environment that signals the gene. Genes are like Christmas tree lights. They're turning on and off all the time. Genes make proteins, and proteins are responsible for the structure and function of your body. The expression of proteins is the expression of life. But if you're interpreting your environment the same way every single day, you're thinking the same thoughts, demonstrating the same behaviors, living by the same emotions, you keep the same genes on and the other genes off. Throw in the hormones of stress, which really downregulates genes to create disease. Then the question is, if the environment signals the gene, and the end product of an experience in your environment is called an emotion, if you live by the same emotions every single day, your body's believing it's in the same past environmental experience over and over again, and now you're headed for a genetic destiny. So then, can you signal the gene ahead of the environment? And the answer is absolutely yes. Well, you come with a lot of genes, and they're just a library of potentials. They're just a storehouse of information, of possibilities. So then you got to get the right signal, the right lock into the key that begins to select and instruct genes that cause genes to make different proteins. And you can regulate so many different genes, the same genes, you can regulate them differently. So when they upregulate, they start producing really healthy and robust proteins. And that's enzymes, that's tissue, that's structure, that's function, that's hormones. It's immunoglobulins. When they downregulate because of some alarm, when there's not a lot of energy for long-term building projects, well, then you keep doing that, then the body starts producing cheaper proteins. It's a different signal. It's not a time for growth. And my body began to change dramatically. And I was back on my feet in 10 weeks and back training again at 12 weeks and
I'd never have any pain in my body or in my back, and I just made a deal with myself, and the deal was with this intelligence that if I was ever able to walk again, I'd spend the rest of my life studying the mind-body connection and mind over matter, and pretty much that's what I've been doing since 1986.